probably heard of Impressionism, or you've probably seen a painting by Claude Monet. These paintings of gardens and people boating and dances and flowers were so controversial at the time, even though to us they seem like these really beautiful paintings that are sort of devoid of any political content. However, at the time, these were actually revolutionary. So what made them so controversial? And where does all this turmoil come from? Let's get into it. I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and I'm an art historian, and this is Art Trippin Lecture Series. Hi, I'm Dr. Megan Lorraine Debin, and this is Art Trippin. Impressionism is a movement in art history that roughly dates from about 1865 to 1885. So we're talking about late 19th century, and the setting is Paris, France. What we will see from the Impressionist painters, including artists like Monet, Renoir, Pissarro, Mary Cassatt, Berthe Morisot, and Edgar Degas, are depictions of the daily life of the bourgeoisie in Paris. These artists are interested in capturing the fleeting effects of natural light. So they're interested in how light interacts with an object. When the sunlight is shining on an object, whether it's a building or a chair or whatever it may be, how do the colors of that object change based on the lighting and atmospheric conditions? So the Impressionists are really thinking about, what does the eye see? Now, in order to understand Impressionism and why it was so controversial at the time, you need to understand what came before it. If you haven't already, go back and check out our video on Romanticism. Romanticism is a movement in the late 18th and early 19th century that really begins to open up the art world to more artistic freedom for the artists themselves. There is another movement in between Romanticism and Realism. So Realism is an artistic style from about 1848 to 1900. Let's look at an example of a realist painting by Edouard Manet. Not Claude Monet, but Edouard Manet. Here we're looking at Olympia from 1865. Manet is really a transitional figure, perhaps more associated with realism, but sometimes he's lumped in as kind of the father of the Impressionists. So what do we see depicted in this painting? We see a woman lying on a bed with cushions, and we see another woman bringing in a bouquet of flowers. Now, of course, this is part of that tradition of the reclining female nude that goes all the way back to the Venetian Renaissance. I'm thinking of Tiziano and Giorgione. Think of the Venus of Urbino. Now, in contrast to Tiziano's Venus of Urbino or Giorgione's Sleeping Venus, this is not a mythological figure. This is not the goddess Venus, but instead, this is Olympia. Who is Olympia? Olympia was actually a really well-known sex worker in late 19th century Paris. So this really is a depiction of an actual sex worker. It's not a depiction of a nude female body under the guise of Greek mythology. Here, Manet is totally doing away with the artifice of Greek mythology, of that symbolism, and he is saying this is a woman who exchanges sex for money. And she even has, I love this little detail, she has her shoes on because she is working. This is not a moment of pure pleasure for her, but she is at work. She is also receiving a bouquet of flowers from one of her clients. You will also see that there is this figure of the servant who is clearly African or of African descent. So we can see the legacy of colonialism and racism here in this painting by Manet. Now, if you compare Manet's Olympia to Tiziano's Venus of Urbino, first of all, Manet is doing away with the artifice of mythology. And there's a little detail that I love to point out. Of course, if you look at Manet's Olympia, you see at the foot of the bed is a little black cat. And in contrast, in Tiziano's Venus of Urbino, you see this little dog curled up. The dog in these Renaissance paintings is a symbol of fidelity and loyalty, which is an ideal quality in a Renaissance era bride. Here we have the cat. Does anybody have a cat? Do you have a cat? Have you ever seen a cat? If you know anything about cats, you know that cats cannot be tamed, really. Cats are wild. Cats are fiercely independent. If you tell a cat to not knock the glass off the table, it will look you in the eye as it knocks the glass off the table, right? Cats are wild. They can't be controlled. So here we have a reversal of that idea. The artist is looking back at art history, looking back at Tiziano and Giorgione and the tradition of the reclining female nude and flipping it on its head and depicting something real, something true to the reality of life in 1860s Paris. Now, in addition to this name Olympia, which refers to a popular sex worker in Paris at the time, we also see that the model in the painting was an artist in her own right, Victorine Morent. So she was a working artist in her own right. And the viewers at the salon would recognize her as a fellow artist, and they would also recognize this name Olympia as the name of a popular sex worker. What is so scandalous about this painting? This painting reveals a disinterest in the laws of illusionism, or perhaps even a rejection of the laws of illusionism. If you look back to, let's say, neoclassical painting, the way, for example, the reclining female nude would be depicted in the neoclassical era. Here we're looking at a depiction of Venus. You can see that it's very idealized, that Venus is not looking at us, that she's kind of coy or sleeping, and that her body is presented for the viewer, for the gaze of the viewer to enjoy. In contrast, Manet's Olympia looks directly at us. There's almost a confrontational element, or that she's very empowered. She is looking at the viewer and she is saying, yeah, so what? I exchanged sex for money. What of it? And she's saying this to an audience who very likely has actually patronized this well-known sex worker, Olympia. So these men of the salon are looking at this painting, and it does away with the artifice. It does away with the symbolism of Venus, and it presents a very real person and a very real sex worker, a working class woman of Paris. What else frustrates the critic when this is displayed at the salon? One of the main critiques of this painting was about its lack of naturalism, that the body was very flat. They said that her body was jaundiced with this yellow tint, and that overall the body was depicted very flatly, that there was not a lot of chiaroscuro, and in some areas the body is almost sort of outlined. So this flatness and this urge on the part of Manet to reject that history of art, that chiaroscuro, that naturalism that is so prized by artists of the Renaissance and the neoclassical era. Here in the modern era, the artist is saying, I do not have to subscribe to these really constrictive rules of neoclassical painting or of reality in and of itself. And so in this way, in this rebellious attitude, Manet is laying the foundation for the Impressionists who come along after him. So who are some of these Impressionist artists? Everyone's going to know Claude Monet. He's famous for his series of haystacks where he went out into the French countryside and painted the same haystacks over and over again at different times of day, at different times of the year, and studied the light as it falls on these objects. He did the same thing at Rouen Cathedral, and he's really well known for his landscapes and, of course, his famous gardens and home at Giverny. Some other Impressionists you should know: Pissarro is known for his cityscapes and landscapes. Degas is known for his ballerina paintings. Renoir is known for his bourgeois parties. And Mary Cassatt is often known for her depictions of the relationship between mother and child. In general, all of these Impressionist artists are depicting scenes from the daily life of the bourgeoisie. So this is so different from neoclassicism. These are not images from Roman history. These are not Greek gods and goddesses. These are not even really important contemporary events like we might see in Romanticism. I'm thinking of Goya's 3rd of May or Delacroix's Liberty Leading the People. Instead, who is the subject matter of this painting? These are sort of regular, everyday, upper middle class individuals, the bourgeoisie of Paris, as they're enjoying their kind of relaxing daily life. This is a depiction of bourgeois leisure. So first of all, bourgeois leisure is a kind of radical subject matter, right? So these are not important figures. These are not historical moments. That are regular everyday people doing regular everyday things. This kind of reminds me of when you take a picture of your dinner and you post it on social media. This idea of getting a glimpse into daily life. This is a very new idea in the middle or late 19th century in art history. So we're going to see bourgeois contemporary life. We're going to see urban life, walking on the streets, going to cafes, going to the ballet, which is sort of that era's version of a nightclub, people dancing, or we're going to see artists going out in the countryside, visiting the seaside, getting out of the city and escaping for the weekend. And these artists themselves are part of the bourgeoisie, so they're showing their own lives. It's very similar to something that you might see on an influencer's Instagram, for example. And because these artists are upper middle class, they have a very utopian view of modern life. They're not struggling to put food on the table, so to speak. So they have time to enjoy these leisure activities. And one of those leisure activities is going out and painting and depicting the life around them. One thing that's really interesting that helps make all of this possible is the invention of tubes of paint. Now, if you go back to the Renaissance, an artist had to spend hours in their studio mixing and preparing pigment. They would often have an apprentice or assistant that would help prepare the pigments. But by the 19th century, we see the introduction and sale of tubes of paint, which means artists can grab their tubes of paint, grab a canvas, a portable easel, maybe grab a bottle of red wine, a baguette under the arm, hop on that train and go out into the French countryside and paint for the day. Then they can hop back on that train and head home to Paris. So all of these modern inventions like the steam engine and tubes of paint are part of what bring the Impressionists outside of the artist studio, out into the city, out into the countryside, and out into the park, where they're painting rapidly, quickly from real life. And they're painting in a kind of new technique. They're applying the paint really thickly to the canvas. You can see visible brushstrokes. It's very loosely rendered. It's not detailed. It's painted very quickly, very rapidly. It has a sketchy quality to it. And in fact, this was one of the main complaints of critics of what we now call Impressionist paintings. They said these look like sketches. These look like underpaintings. These look like preparatory images for the real image. They look unfinished. This was one of the chief complaints of critics at the time. Here we're looking at Claude Monet's Impression Sunrise from 1872. This is often referred to as the painting that announces Impressionism as a historical movement. Now remember, the artists did not all wake up one day and say, we are now Impressionists. Actually, this term Impressionism comes from a critic who complained about these paintings. So, what's the story behind this painting, and where does this term Impressionism come from? The Impressionist artists that we've been talking about, Monet, Renoir, Degas, these artists had started creating a new painting style, and they submitted their paintings to the Salon. If you haven't seen our video on the Salon, check out our video on the French Salon. So these artists submit their paintings to the Salon and they are rejected. There's 8 of them who are rejected from the Salon. And instead of just taking the L and moving on, these artists say, actually, we're going to open up our own Salon des Refusés, the Salon or the art show of the rejects. And they go across the street basically and have their own art show where they put up these new paintings, this new style of painting. And a French art critic saw these paintings and he coined this term Impressionism after this specific painting by Claude Monet, Impression Sunrise from 1872. The critic wrote, if one wants to characterize them with a single word that explains their efforts, one would have to create the new term Impressionists, in the sense that they render not a landscape, but the sensation produced by a landscape. So in fact, this term Impressionism comes from a critic who is not really much of a fan of these paintings, but this terminology stuck and we still call them the Impressionists today. Now this painting, Impression Sunrise, is typical of Impressionism. First of all, what are the Impressionists interested in doing? The Impressionists are interested in the optical experience at a specific moment under specific conditions of light and atmosphere. They are interested in vision. They are interested in what the eye sees and capturing that moment, that immediacy of sensation, that snapshot. They're capturing that on the canvas. So when we look at Claude Monet's Impression Sunrise, we can get the idea of standing out before the water, looking out to this port, the sun slowly rising, the fishermen coming in on the boats. We can get the sense of being out in this cold, misty morning, watching the sunrise over the water. We see the water and the sky kind of mix in this hazy combination of blue, gold, little dabs of crimson. We see these small boats and figures coming in, but they are suggested rather than carefully detailed. There's no sense of linear perspective. There's really no sense of foreground, middle ground, and background. Everything is kind of flattened on the picture plane. So he's done away with the illusionism of Renaissance and neoclassical era art. Instead of trying to capture every detail of the moment, he's trying to capture the feeling of a foggy, misty morning. You can almost hear the foghorn as you gaze upon this scene. What's this new technique of the Impressionists? You can see that the paint is applied very thickly to the canvas, very loosely, and it's not blended. And in fact, the surface is textured. So if you rub your hand across it, please do not touch the paintings in the museum. But if you were to rub your hand across the painting, you would have this like kind of bumpy feeling. And in contrast, a neoclassical painting would be very smooth. Everything would be very tightly and precisely rendered. And we would see no evidence of the artist's hand. The artists in the neoclassical era are trying to sort of disappear their hands. They're trying to do almost what a photograph can do. But now, by 1872, we have the beginning of the proliferation of photographic images. So if I can sit for a photographic portrait, then what is the point of an oil painter? What can artists do when the camera can already replicate reality? So what Monet is trying to capture is something that at the time photography cannot capture. 19th century photography is a very slow process. People would have to sit still, sometimes for up to 7, 10, 15 minutes, and they would be very frozen and very stiff. And as you know, they would be in sort of black and white or sepia tones. So we did not have full color photography, and you could not grab your iPhone and snap a picture really quickly. Everything had to be very posed and very frozen. So the Impressionists are trying to capture what the camera cannot capture at the time, which is the vibrancy of color, the atmospheric conditions, and a snapshot, a moment in time. So when we look at Monet's Impression Sunrise, we see that Monet is painting not every single detail of what he sees, but what it would look like and how you would feel if you were standing there on that exact same day in those exact same atmospheric conditions. The sunrise will look different than the sunset. The winter sunrise will look different from a summer sunrise. The painting duplicates the sensation of watching this sunrise, the optical illusion, this transitory, fleeting moment. If you've ever watched a sunrise or a sunset, you know they go fast. You know you've got a short window of time and then it's gone. And so this vision, this view that you have is ephemeral. It's something that doesn't last, that will soon disappear within 10-15 minutes. That moment will be gone. This is what Monet is trying to capture on the canvas. And we can see this in other works by Monet if we look at his haystacks. So here we can see Haystacks End of Summer Morning from 1891. And you can see the sun is very high above the earth, and we have these really warm, rich tones, lots of reds and oranges in these golden haystacks. But then you can look at Monet's haystacks in the wintertime, and they're covered in snow, and we see all of these cool colors, purple and blue. We can see that Monet is going out and looking at these haystacks outdoors. So the artist again is going out of the studio, out into the world, out into real life, and working rapidly and painting outside and doing multiple canvases of the same subject matter, just with changing conditions of light and atmosphere. So we see time depicted on the canvas. There are no preparatory drawings, and this sketchiness, this looseness of the application of paint. The paintbrush is constantly moving around the canvas, and the brushstrokes are very loose. They're not blended. And in fact, sometimes you'll see very visible brushstrokes, as if you can see where the artist put the paint onto the canvas, lifted the paintbrush, and did it again. And so we have what is referred to as the divided brushstroke. That's that visible brushstroke. And when you step back from the painting, the eye kind of blends those brushstrokes. So the artist is not actually painting all of these tones, but the tones and shading is blended by the eye. Claude Monet did the same thing that he did with the haystacks at Rouen Cathedral. So if you look at his paintings of Rouen Cathedral, you can see in this series, he studies what light does to this cathedral, how it looks early in the morning, late at night, how it looks in the summer and the winter, and how the changing atmospheric conditions impact what the eye sees. Remember that the camera has already been developed in the 19th century, and the camera documents some quote-unquote truth of reality. Truth is a complicated term nowadays, but the idea is that reality can be replicated through the photograph. This machine can take an image of something that actually exists. So what does Impressionism do? Impressionism, in contrast, helps recreate the sensation of that moment for the viewer. Even though it might not involve every little detail, you're gonna get the feeling of being present in that moment of time. Another impressionist that you may be familiar with is Camille Pissarro. Here we're looking at Avenue de l'Opéra, sun, winter afternoon, 1898. So here we can see Pissarro looking out from his sort of apartment window or studio window out onto the streets of Paris. The streets of Paris, the bustling urban life of Paris, the movement of people and horse carriages, all of this is depicted in Impressionist paintings. And you can see, again, that not every detail is depicted. We get a sense of the street receding back into space and people moving about, but there are no details. Some of the figures are just sort of blobs of paint. You know, a gentleman's top hat might just be a blob of black paint. So we get the impression of the image. We get a sense of the atmospheric conditions. It's kind of a hazy, foggy, day, but there is a little bit of sun, and we can see the shadows of the buildings cast onto the ground. And Pissarro was older than some of the other Impressionists. He's a Danish-French Impressionist, and he's actually born on the island of St. Thomas, but he eventually moves to Paris. He completely does away with preparatory sketches, and he's really interested in immediacy, in painting from vision. So he's thinking, like Courbet, the realist painter, that we should only paint what we see. We see with the Impressionist painters an increasing de-emphasis on line and structure and really a focus on color. Here Pissarro painting up from this high balcony, and it is said that he wasn't super sociable. He liked to be alone in his room and painting, or he would like to go out into the countryside. So you'll see a lot of landscapes from Pissarro. But we don't see the details depicted. We see the impression. We see the atmospheric conditions. We see that reality is experienced in a blur, in emotion, as a sensation, not every teeny little detail. Unlike most of the other Impressionists, Pissarro actually preferred country life to city life. So you will see in his landscapes an appreciation for nature and an appreciation again for the atmospheric conditions. In this landscape by Pissarro, we can see this pathway that the people are walking on. This cobblestone street is wet with the rain, and we can see the light reflecting on the cobblestone street, which is something that we also see in another Impressionist, Gustave Caillebotte, in his Paris, A Rainy Day from 1877. We see the same atmospheric depiction of the light reflecting on the wet cobblestone and the sidewalk of these Parisian city streets. Now, when we look at Caillebotte, we can see that this is not that sketchy, loose style that we've seen with Monet and Pissarro. So again, remember, the Impressionists are individual artists. Each artist will have their own style. Caillebotte's style, especially when depicting these figures, this gentleman and lady walking under the umbrella, his style is more tightly rendered. His figures are more smoothly rendered. They're not just these blobs of paint. So every artist will have their own style, and Caillebotte's is different from the other Impressionists in these tightly rendered figures, but we see that he has that same interest in light and the atmospheric conditions. And we also see on the far right side of the painting, a figure being cut off, and we have this couple walking towards us. And the idea is that in another moment, they will be walking out of the frame. So we're sort of capturing a moment. This is not a frozen portrait of people sitting posed, but we are getting a moment of hustle and bustle of the Parisian city streets. Another great example of an Impressionist painting is Pierre-Auguste Renoir's Le Moulin de la Galette. This is from 1876, and this is a depiction of people dancing and drinking out at a cafe, which is akin to a modern day club where people are drinking and dancing. There's music playing, the figures are dancing beneath these trees, and you can see that Renoir is really interested in how the light falls onto these figures as it's funneled through these trees. So let's look at an example. Let's look at the gentleman who has his back to us. You can see that on the back of his coat, you have these kind of spots. You can also see it on his hair. And just above, you see a gentleman in a straw hat. That hat has these same patches. These patches are the shadows that are being cast by the trees that are above these individuals. So here Renoir is studying how the light filters through these trees and casts shadows. We also have this sense of movement. You can almost hear the piano music playing and the chatter of conversation in the background, the glasses clinking. It almost feels like we're out at this day club with these Parisians from late 19th century. And we see this over and over again with Renoir. Here's another Renoir, The Luncheon of the Boating Party from 1880 to 1881. Again, you can see All of these people gathered. It's perhaps a nice summer afternoon, and they have gathered outside. They're eating and drinking. You can see the wine on the table, the fruit. You've got this woman who's playing with her little dog, and you've got a mix of middle class people. So if you look in the background, you can see a gentleman in a black top hat and a black coat. This is a dandy. This is an upper middle class gentleman or a member of the bourgeoisie. And then you will see these two ladies chit-chatting with these guys in these straw hats and these white tank tops. This is more of working class attire. So you can see working class people and the bourgeoisie interacting together. This is sort of a depiction of middle class life in Paris in the late 19th century. And if you look at some details, if you zoom in and look at details of the wine bottles on the table or the fruit, you can see that the paint is again applied in this very thick, very loose, very sketchy manner. So with Renoir, like Monet and Pissarro, we have a very loose style and we have an interest in capturing a fleeting moment. This is like you're out to dinner with your friends and you take a video or a picture of the scene in the restaurant. These images are really banal. It's almost as something like capturing a snapshot at a party in your friend's backyard and then sort of posting it to social media. That's how kind of everyday or basic these images are. This is revolutionary subject matter at the time, right? These are not heroic figures winning a battle, fighting for the liberty of France. They're just regular people enjoying their middle class lifestyle. Another well-known Impressionist artist is Edgar Degas, who is known for his depictions of ballerinas. Here we're looking at the ballet rehearsal from 1874. First of all, you can see a very unusual composition. There's not one figure who is centered. There are some figures that are pushed off to the side. There's a kind of strange asymmetrical empty space. There's a staircase on the left side that spirals up. So it's an unusual composition, and the subject matter is also unusual. The way Parisians thought about ballet dancers at the time is not the same as we think about ballet dancers now. Yes, it was a very physically demanding occupation, but it was also very much a lower class or working class occupation, and a lot of these women, or in some cases girls, who worked in the ballet were trying to make it. I think it might be more similar to someone who is a dancer, like a pole dancer. It's very hard work, but a lot of these women are trying to bring themselves out of the lower or working classes and make some money. And in fact, these ballet dancers would benefit from these clients who would sort of sponsor them, almost like, I don't know, a sugar daddy, sort of. And Degas is giving us a glimpse into this world. Now, these look like very pretty, very elegant paintings, and they are, but at the time, the ballet did not have the same kind of social status that it has today in our contemporary era. You've been hearing a lot of names of men artists, but there were women artists who were associated with Impressionism, and one of the greats is Berthe Morisot. Here we're looking at Villa at the Seaside from 1874, and if you are local to the Los Angeles area, you can see this painting at the Norton Simon Museum in Pasadena. Here, Berthe Morisot is depicting her sister and her niece out at the seaside. They're at a villa outside of Paris and they're relaxing. It's bourgeois leisure. We see that also in Berthe Morisot's Summer Day from 1879. And here we can see that really loose, really wild brushstroke. We have two ladies with hats and parasols in a boat out on a lake enjoying their leisure time. And again, you see that wild, loose brushstrokes. If you look at some details, for example, of the woman's sleeve on the jacket, you can just see this zigzag of paint. There are even some areas where the canvas shows through. So this is really not tightly rendered. It's done rapidly and with a sense of urgency that's trying to capture the sense of movement of modern Parisian life. Now, we've been talking about a lot of French artists, but there were Impressionist movements in other countries, and there was a very well-known American Impressionist artist who lived and worked sometime in Paris. I'm speaking, of course, of Mary Cassatt. Here we're looking at the boating party from 1893, and we see Cassatt mixing some of these two different styles. You can see this woman and a child in a boat and a man rowing the boat. So we see a depiction of bourgeois leisure. In some parts of the painting, I'm looking specifically at the back of the gentleman's clothing and his face, and we can see that kind of tightly rendered style that we see with Caillebotte. But if you look to the water or some other areas of the painting, we have this very loosely applied paint without any blending and with this visible or divided brushstroke. Mary Cassatt is also really well known for her depictions of women with their children. This is in part due to her gender, that she was in many ways kind of confined to the home, or if she was out and about, usually she would have to be accompanied by a gentleman. Because of her gender, she did have access to these kind of more intimate moments of women with their children. So here we are looking at Mary Cassatt's The Bath from about 1892. And here we see that mother and child engage in an intimate domestic act. And we can see that kind of depiction of daily life that the Impressionists are so well known for. Now, if you want to hear more about Mary Cassatt, and specifically I want to talk about the Japanese influence on Impressionist and post-Impressionist artists, stay tuned for our next video on the Japanese influence on late 19th century French art. As always, like and subscribe. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments, and stay tuned for more Art Trippin lecture series.